So welcome once more to our 7th International Press Luncheon. This time we are covering 1 year of Russia's war against Ukraine. This is a sad and awful anniversary with incredible suffering in Ukraine. And our hearts and our souls are with all in Ukraine who fight this fight for freedom and democracy. And I want to express our sincere gratitude to all the Ukrainian people. Over the past year, the eyes of the world have been on Ukraine, with major news and media agencies providing live reports. And I would say perhaps never before have we seen such a visible coverage of any war in Ukraine, in Europe, and maybe even any war around the world, but that is maybe something we can discuss later on. And the media plays, without a doubt, a very important role in informing the world about developments in the war, but also in documenting war crimes and shaping public opinion about the war, and then also the response by national governments. And this is really what we want to look at today. How has media portrayal of the war influenced the global response? How has it really been to report from the war? How has media's representation of the war also changed over time? And what are journalists experiencing reporting from Ukraine? And we have a absolutely stellar panel with us today. And I couldn't be more happy because these are all journalists reporting from Ukraine or having reported or are Ukrainian and really have a lot of experience. And it's a great, great pleasure introducing each and every single one of them, although I'm pretty sure you know many of them, either from listening to the radio every day, reading the newspaper, or watching television. First of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce Katrin Eigendorf. Katrin Eigendorf is international reporter in Ukraine for ZDF. She has worked for ZDF since 1999, initially as a reporter in what was then ZDF's main foreign affairs department, but she has also covered, or she has also reported from the ZDF studio in Moscow, among other things, on the conflict in Ukraine. Katrin, thank you so much for joining us today. Also, it's a great pleasure to introduce Olga Rudenko to you, Olga. Thank you so much for being here today. Olga is the chief editor of the Kiev Independent, which is an award-winning media startup launched in November 2021. So it's a pretty still, new, young media outlet. And Olga is the former deputy chief editor of the Kiev Post. Olga, you have written for many global publications, and you have earned many, just as Katrin has as well, many different prizes. And among others, you were on the cover of Time magazine in May 2022 as one of the publication's next generation leaders in the world. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's also a very great pleasure to introduce Joanna Kakizis. Joanna is an international correspondent based in Kiev, Ukraine, where she leads the NPR's bureau. And she began reporting in Ukraine shortly before Russia invaded in February. And she covered the exodus of refugees to Poland, for example. And Joanna, you have returned to Ukraine several times to chronicle the war. And I have to ask, are you currently on the ground in Kiev?
I'm in Kiev. I'm not, I'm in my bureau, and I'm going to be based here all year. And I love Kiev, so I'm very happy about that. It's a great city.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And it's also a great pleasure introducing Steffen Schwarzkopf. He is chief reporter for the news channel Welt TV. I almost pronounced it in an English way, World TV, Welt TV. Previously, Steffen was in charge of the Welt studio in Washington, for 6 years. I hope, Stefan, that you can share with us both about the situation in Ukraine, but maybe we can also talk about the US position and a little bit about transatlantic relations with you.
Absolutely.
And he is also an award-winning journalist, like all of our participants today. And I could spend the whole hour just introducing all of them. So I hope it is okay with all of you that I shortened your CV a little bit. But you can read up afterwards about them, because it's really amazing what they have all achieved and done over the past. And so has Emma Graham Harrison. She is Senior International Affairs Correspondent at the UK's Guardian and Observer. And she has also won multiple awards for her international reporting and investigative journalism. Thank you so much for making the time, Emma, being here today. And last but not least, it's also a great pleasure to welcome Matthias Böhlinger. He has been a the Ukraine correspondent for Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster. He has, please correct me if I'm mistaken, been doing so since January 2022. He has witnessed the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion on the ground and has been reporting on the war ever since. Thank you, Matthias, so much for joining us today as well.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I would like to start with the same question to all of you, and that is how the war has been covered and reporting on. And I would like to ask you how objective this reporting has been over the last year, and if you would give it a grade from 1 to 10, for 1 like no objective at all to 10 very, very objective. I would like to hear from you what grade you would award and why that is the case. And I would love to start with Stefan on that question.
Yes, sure. So actually, I don't want to comment on the media worldwide, and I cannot speak for all the reporters, no matter whether they're coming from the US or from Europe. So, but I can probably speak for myself and also for the reporters that I've been working with in the last couple of months. And very often I met, of course, Katrin and other correspondents from Germany, and I'm pretty convinced that we're all trying to do our best to be as fact-based, to be as truthful, to be as neutral as possible. But, and here comes the but, of course, we're human beings, and of course, we're never 100% neutral, and we're, of course, reporting from Ukraine, and we're talking to Ukrainian people, and we're talking to Ukrainian politicians, and we're talking to Ukrainian soldiers and military. So I think we just get emotionally involved all the time, and that's why I cannot say for myself that I'm 100% neutral. So I would give it probably an 8 out of 10.
Thank you so much. And maybe we come back to a couple of points you raised, that this is a reporting on the go, that it maybe sometimes also becomes emotional, and maybe we can pick that up later on again. Olga, what would you say?
I was thinking before the event about the grade. I think I would give, if you were talking about like all the global media coverage of the war, that would be somewhere around 6 or 7, but that's a 6 or 7 that is very unevenly spread between reporting in various countries, and also reporting like through like as it was happening in the first weeks compared to like how it's happening now. Like, for example, I was just before this event, I was looking at this interesting survey that was asking the audiences in various countries how what they've been reading and watching about the war in Ukraine influenced their perception of Russia. And the question was, do you now think that Russia is stronger than you used to think, or is it weaker than you used to think? And if you look at the UK, the overwhelmingly the audiences think that Russia turned out to be weaker, and if you're looking at India and China, they think Russia is stronger than they used to think a year ago. And that tells you about how different the angle is and the reporting is. So it's very, very dependent on the country and also the time.
Thank you so much. Katrin, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to measure this in grades because this is a special war and we are in a special situation. We can only report from this war from the pure Ukrainian perspective. This was different back in 2014 when we were able to go on the other side and also to talk about what's happening on, with separatists and with their motivation. So there is no objectivity at all in reporting because as Steffen mentioned it, we are all human beings and the human brain tends to sort out what we see in reality. That's the first step. So I think we are all reporting through our eyes on these wars with our background that we bring, completely different. But I think the way we reported on this war, if I could put this general on German media, I would say it's quite successful, and I wouldn't say like we tend to paint a false picture on reality. It's very difficult because this is the best documented war we've ever seen in history. And there's so much propaganda, so many lies and disinformation on the market that as a reporter, it's really difficult to sort out what reality is. And you can only do this when you take the risk to go where things happen, to see what really happens. You can't make reporting on this war from the internet, only from what you see. And I think all the reporters that I've seen working in Ukraine, they're taking a lot of risks to do this. And I said it's difficult to give a grade for that, but I think that we fulfilled the objective to inform about what's going on in Ukraine as much as this is possible.
Thank you so much. The issue of reporting from one's own eyes and with the own cultural backpack, so to say, that's something I would love to pick up on later again in our discussion. But let me also now turn to Emma. How do you view the reporting on Ukraine?
So, I mean, I think you have to slightly separate out the fact that, yes, we're human beings and we have sympathy generally for people, you know, in Ukraine. I think those of us who've spent time on the ground and what we do with our reporting. And I actually think, again, speaking only for my own paper here, not the broader background, I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to be objective, which I think serves both our readers. And in fact, if you have sympathy with, you know, Ukraine, is also in a way a service to that cause, because I think the horrors of what's happening there don't need, of course you need activists and people doing that work as well, but actually I think letting them speak for themselves and just providing something that is as much as possible a documentation of things that you can verify yourself is incredibly powerful and important. And, you know, just a very small example, I remember at the beginning of the war, everybody got terribly excited about the Ghost of Kyiv, this sort of fighter pilot, and some fellow British papers, I will name no names, sort of got very excited and wrote articles about it. And we were sort of like, well, we don't know who this guy is. We don't know if he really exists. There's lots of interesting stuff going on in terms of Ukraine not losing control of the airspace. Why don't we just write about that? And it turned out that, in fact, the Ghost of Kyiv was a sort of propaganda, not a real fighter. And so I think things like that, you know, I think writing a story about the Ghost of Kyiv, it was seductive, it was sort of a great story, but actually it wasn't, you know, I don't think doing that kind of reporting is or avoiding doing that kind of thing is what we're trying to do. So keeping our reporting objective, even if as human beings who spend a lot of time on the ground in Ukraine, you know, we have our personal sympathies. And I think as a paper overall, we've also been trying to, again, I think understanding what's going on in Russia is really important. And we have colleagues who are still reporting from Russia. I don't think they're able to get to the very front lines, but they're speaking to a lot of the people most directly affected. And, you know, again, I think that's, several of us have been sanctioned by Russia, so they can't go there, but we do still have colleagues who can and are. And I think that's a really important part of doing what we do. So I think you can, I mean, of course, no one can ever be 100% objective. And I think pretending, as someone just said, pretending we're automatons or robots is impossible. But I do think you can stick to trying to provide verified facts in an appropriate context that is fairly objective reporting, or as objective as you possibly can. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Joanna, you were nodding a couple of times, so you agree.
Yeah, I feel like I'll say, you know, what Emma said. With radio, the challenge is, you know, making a story, because the human voice is so intimate. It's, you know, you have to package it and deliver it in a much more sort of, you know, human focused way, I guess, than you would in a newspaper article. That's not saying that newspaper articles don't also have, you know, great power in them. The Guardian's done some of the most beautiful features, in my opinion, during this war. But so in terms of objectivity, what we in delivering the news in an audio format, you have to think like, let's verify the story that we're hearing, make sure it's true, make sure it's in context, and make sure we deliver it in a way that our audiences can understand. Sometimes with, again, in audio, a lot of information comes out, and you want to make sure that you can keep the listener oriented. I think we've done that pretty well. I think we've tried to deliver not only human stories, because like Emma said, there's just so much to document. And, you know, sometimes you can go someplace and hold on a microphone and get so many good and powerful stories that are also pretty easy to verify and document. But you also have to give some sort of context so the listeners understand sort of where they are, what it means, you know, maybe historical background. We've tried to do a little bit of everything. I think we've done a pretty good job. I kind of wish, the only thing I wish is that we'd been more in frontline situations, which our security team has been very cautious about. But I've seen some frontline reporting that's been very, very powerful. One area that I had really wanted to go to was Mariupol, and we never got there. And since then, I've been talking to, you know, people who have either left or who are exiled from the city council, and I feel like if there's some way to get all those voices together into one piece, it would be a beautiful piece. So yeah, we've tried to give context, we've tried to give a history, we've tried to give as many voices their due. I'm constantly in contact with the Moscow correspondent, so I try to get the perspective from Russia as well, and keep that in mind when I'm writing my stories. But it's hard. We don't have a huge team, so we have to make do with the resources we have. But we try to keep all those details in mind when we're reporting. How would I grade us? I don't know if I should grade us, if I'll get in trouble. If I do, I guess I would give us maybe a 7 or an 8 on how we've done. I think we've done pretty well.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Matthias, what is your take on reporting on Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, rather than like giving a mark, I'd like to highlight 2 or 3 points that I feel have changed during this war in what reporting is concerned. It's that a lot of reporters came into the country who have never been here, or who have not reported from this region before, and they might have also not been specialists on Russia, on the region, on Eastern Europe. So the perspective has changed, I feel, a little bit when Ukraine was reported. Mostly it was the Moscow correspondents who were reporting on Ukraine, and that shifted the focus a little bit to this bilateral perspective, which is, of course, what is happening now. This war is a war between Russia and Ukraine, but the perspective was pretty much influenced from what was important to notice in Russia. That does not mean that they would be in any way close to Putin, but we are seeing a lot more stories about Ukrainian society, about the perception of Ukrainian society in international media than we have seen also in 2014. That doesn't mean that it wasn't reported, but it was just not the same amount, and it was not the same diversity of reporting. That's maybe something that's also that we can also highlight, which is just because there is such an enormous amount of journalists in the country. I think that's something that I would highlight. I don't know how this fits into the question of objectivity, and Katrin has rightly mentioned that we have a few black spots in our reporting, and that's notably what is happening behind the front line in these areas that also many like Moscow correspondents do not get access to. That is also not something that can be reported from the other side. What's happening in the city of Donetsk now, for example, is something we get either through the filter of Ukrainian officials who have their sources, or through the filter of Moscow officials, and both sides have an interest in twisting this information in their way. So these black spots, they exist for reasons that we have no influence. It's not that we are too lazy to go to the other side, it's that we cannot go. So that, of course, is something, if we talk about objectivity, that's a constraint. I do see a lot of attempts to understand this war from many different perspectives, and that's maybe not yet objectivity, but that is a very important. It's a very important part of the reporting. Objectivity also is it's difficult because it's not 100% achievable. There's no standard for objectivity, but it also carries, of course, the risk of false balance. We have a very different information environment in Ukraine and in Russia. We are fed very different information from officials in terms of truthfulness. So that makes everything very difficult, and we get a lot more accurate information from the Ukrainian side than from the Russian side. But on the same hand, of course, every government official everywhere in the world has an interest in providing the information that they want. So lots of constraints here, lots of constraints also geographically. This front line is very long. Things can be very different at different parts of the front line. If you see one spot, that does not mean you understand how it's working. It's not like reporting from, I don't know, the Hong Kong troubles in 2019, or the Maidan, when many things that were happening were pretty much concentrated in one area. So I find it difficult. I think the judgment of how objective we were will be made much later when more information is available. I can only say that I see tremendous commitment by anybody I've met here to get this right.
Thank you so much, Matthias. And we come back to the issue of reporting in real time, so to say, and under high uncertainty. And I would love to hear from all of you how you actually also do the fact checking and how you interpret what you hear and how you do this. But one thing I wanted to pick up on what Matthias said is some of the journalists who came to Ukraine were really no experts on Ukraine before they started to report. And this is, I want to bring in Olga again, asking you, so where is it, do you think, also foreign correspondents might get it still wrong? Are there things which are maybe hard to understand when you come from the outside? And is there a learning curve you also observe?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's definitely a big learning curve, as with any country. I mean, just to say it upfront, I think that a lot of international correspondents working in Ukraine are doing a stellar job, and I mean, being absolutely great. At the same time, of course, mistakes happen. often inadvertently. I don't think that anybody comes, travels to Kyiv thinking I'm gonna write a bad report that's gonna twist facts or something. Mistakes happen because it's a very nuanced country. It's a very nuanced landscape, and the world did not really know that much about Ukraine and did not understand that much about Ukraine before the full-scale invasion, even though the war in Ukraine has been going on for 8 years before that. It started in 2014, but it was sort of briefly in the global focus in 2014, and then the attention shifted away. So it's like the global community was discovering Ukraine all anew, and the journalism community as well. I think the two main mistakes, if you want to call it that, or areas of mistakes, is one. It is something that I think Matthias mentioned. The world, including journalists, has had a habit of looking at Ukraine and the whole region through a Russian lens. All the bureaus were in Russia, everything was in Moscow. So people who wanted to cover Ukraine for the New York Times, they would travel either from Moscow or from Brussels, and not be based in Ukraine. And that's so, and that's not something that is new. Actually, this situation goes back decades and decades, back to the Soviet Union time, back to pre-Soviet Union time. The world has been looking at this region as Russia plus. Russia is this central entity that is eternal, can't go away, can't lose a war. It's very big, it's very powerful, and there is something murky around it. Like there is a Ukraine, there is a Belarus, there is something called like Estonia for some people. That's also like part of the general area, unfortunately. And that is gradually changing now. But another more dangerous area of mistakes is something that we can call a fake objectivity when it comes to reporting. This, as some of the speakers mentioned already, the access is very unequal. I mean, Ukraine uses almost all the access, apart from some of the dangerous parts of the front line where it's hard to get to. But in general, access to information is so tilted towards Ukraine, and you don't get much stuff out of Russia. And what we see is this dangerous trend of journalists trying to compensate for the lack of information coming from Russia by doing this thing. They come to Ukraine, they collect information here, they collect reports, they do the work on the ground, they see stuff happening with their own eyes, they report on that, and then they need a second side. And because they can't get it on the ground from Russia, they would cite Putin's spokespeople, people from the Russian government, who and add it to their stories, to their reporting as sort of the second side. So by doing that, they effectively equalize the actual facts they've seen on the ground to something that is propaganda that is being said by somebody in Moscow, because they need a second side, because that's what we've been taught, right? Like, we need a second side. And that leads to this false equalization of we're equalizing the facts with propaganda. We're saying, like, there's this is what is happening, this is what Russia says is happening. But we can't, I generally think it's very irresponsible to do that. And we have to have a better judgment as journalists than to tell our readers, look, like, there is two options what you can believe. Like, option one is, here's what we've seen. Option two, this is what Russia says. Those can't be equal in a story or in a video report or in a radio report. And that's unfortunately what we see happening. And one of the biggest moments in this year when it manifested itself was in September, when Russia was holding the so-called referendums in the occupied territories of Ukraine, the annexation votes. If you look at the coverage of that in mainstream Western media, a lot of them, including biggest news agencies like Reuters, covered it as if it was an actual vote. Like, if you look at the headlines, you would not know that those were fake referendums where people were made to vote, cast their vote, being threatened with a gun often. And it's insane if you think about it. And when I talk to, when I talk off the record to my colleagues from some of those outlets, who are also unhappy with the way their editors, tell them to cover it, they say that they were told that if their outlet reports it as a fake referendum, if this is the wording they use, the fake referendum or the staged referendum, then this, in opinion of their editors, is tilting the balance too much towards Ukraine. And that's insane because, I mean, talk to the people on the ground, like make phone calls. You can talk to people on the occupied territories using like safe message apps and stuff. And you can hear their stories. They would tell you what it looked like on the ground. So it is so responsible to just take what Russia says and pass it to your reader without even adding context that this is a staged referendum. No, Russia says it's a referendum, then we're going to report it as a referendum. That's not like, how are you adding value as a reporter if you're doing that? So that's one of the dangerous trends that have been going on in international reporting.
Thank you so much, Olga, for showing us this so vividly. And I want to bring in Katrin into the discussion. You were saying absolutely with regard to
I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of pressure put on journalists reporting on the war in Ukraine. It was already a lot of pressure back in 2014, and it's a little bit less because now the picture is more clear who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. But nevertheless, Putin plays in his hybrid warfare very well with the fact that we as journalists from Western media are raised with the idea we have to show perspectives. Yeah, but let's put one example. When we were able to see what happened in Bucha, when we came as the journalists to Bucha, and we saw with our own eyes what Russian soldiers did to the population. And the same day, the Russian side, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov called this a staged event, so to say. And I was asked by my colleagues in the headquarters, like how Zelensky reacted. Was this fake? Was this a play? Was this maybe staged? We should put this into question. No, we shouldn't put this into question. We should call this what it is, a lie. And I think what we as reporters need is to make a stand for real reporting. And of course, you better know the situation, you better know the country, and the better your information is, the better you can make that stand. And this he says, she says reporting, I think it is really dangerous. And I observe this in Western media, especially also in German media. The referendum is another story. We can only take a position against this by what I said, going and see what really happened. And it is our task as journalists to inform our audience. And informing doesn't only mean repeating whatever is said. Russia's disinformation, Russia's lies have to be mentioned and have to be declared as what they are. And I think in a few years and maybe sooner, we will see that journalism and our idea of what real reporting is will change with this war. Mm-hmm. Because I think what I mentioned, it will change our perspective from what we learn always tell this side said this and this side said this. And what really frustrates me a lot is I'm also reporting on other war situations. And when I'm discussing this, I always ask, when it comes to the Taliban, I'm reporting now, did you ever put in the perspective that maybe beheading of women or torturing people might have a reason? Would you ever get the Taliban's perspective on the picture? No, of course not, because this is not a perspective we should take into account, yeah? Because it is absolutely wrong. And we have to declare it as wrong, because our reporting is based on human rights, free media, and this is all what Russia is working against. And yeah, that's what I wanted to add to this.
Well, thank you so much, Katrin. And I'm conscious that you do have to leave pretty soon. But I also wanted to ask you, you have been reporting on Russia and Ukraine since 2014. So you're very aware of the situation on the ground, but also the reporting about the situation. Would you say that we paid too little globally, too little attention also in media of what happened between 2014 and 2022?
I would say even worse. I can only speak for German media. German media completely painted a wrong picture of what was going on in Russia already from 2000 on. I mean, the idea that Putin would search in a way a coexistence with European countries, that in a way he would be a democrat, that in a way he would modernize Russia. This is completely wrong. And all of us who have reported on the country knew it from the beginning, but nobody wanted to listen to us. Nobody listened to it. And when you would declare this and when you would report on this, you would always be pushed on the side. Yeah, you're painting the picture too black. We have to see the perspective, and so on and so on. And that led to the fact that in 2014, I mean, the way we reported on the war of Russia against Ukraine was completely mistaken. I mean, we called this in a way a civil war. There was never a civil war in Ukraine. Separatist movement in Ukraine only exists because it was raised and fed by Russia. And I think it's so important that reporters who know about the situation, reporters who give arguments and have knowledge, and we have a lot of them in Germany, a lot, that they get an eye and an ear, and not only put like in the corner and not being taken serious. And we have not only politicians have to take consequences, like what their wrong behavior was, but also journalists, also media, because the media took part in this, yeah, being a tool of Russian disinformation. And yeah, I think sooner or later we should also take a deeper look on that.
Thank you so much for these open words. Before I come back to Joanna and also Emma, I would like to stay for a couple of seconds with Germany and our perception and maybe also misperception that what Katrin just showed us. And we have to say goodbye to Katrin. She has to jump on a train.
Yeah, sorry, I have to jump on a train. It was really great sharing ideas with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Matthias and Steffen, I wanted to ask you if you're sharing Katrin's perspective and what she just told us, or if you have a more nuanced picture. And I also want to ask both of you, how come? How come that actually happened, and how come that in Germany we thought so long that interdependence would prevent any hot conflict? And maybe we start with Matthias and then Steffen.
Yeah, more nuance always sounds good, right? So I just add one thing. Katrin has said it, but I just want to highlight this. All the information was available in German as well about what was going on. But the interpretation of it was pretty much also influenced by intense lobbying inside Germany. It was, as Katrin has said, not always the correspondence in Russia. For example, if we talk about Russia now, Ukraine is, I'll get to that a little later. That they were not always listened to. Of course, there were different perspectives on how severe this is in Russia. And not everything that we see now was maybe as visible at the time, but you cannot say that nobody knew about the Chechen wars and about the brutality with which Putin did that. And it was not the Moscow correspondents who applauded him in the Bundestag. It was the parliament that applauded him, and it was these lobby groups that were very much able to push their narrative under the Schröder government and into the times of the Merkel government. And that's a question that journalists have to ask themselves, why this has been happening. I totally agree with that, but it's not the Moscow reporting community that I would hold responsible for this first and foremost. The other thing, the perspective on Ukraine is, I think, really, as Ola has said it, pretty much due to the fact that there were very, very few bureaus in Ukraine. I think until this year, for the German media, I think there was DPA, which is a news agency, and not, it's very influential because it provides the information, but it's not the one shaping the discourse as actively as others. And DW has had an office here since 2014, but this was basically it. And I also heard from my predecessors that there were times when Ukraine was not really high on the agenda, when the interest was much lower, of course, than it is today, when we have, of course, the result of everything that has been happening during all that time. So again, it's not the lack of interest in Ukraine, and those Moscow correspondents who covered Ukraine in 2014, in 2015, many of them did an excellent job, and they were absolutely not, again, pro-Russian, but they did not have the ears on the ground in Ukraine. They did not catch many of the developments in Ukraine. So in a way, yes, media, society, politically influential circles were just too lazy to listen and to get deeper into this. And then there was the historical constraint, the efforts to paint every movement here that was nationalist, patriotic. No, there's a big range of opinions within all this society, which might have a common ground, that they see Ukraine as distinct, very distinctive from Russia, but which have very, very different interpretations of history. And the Russian move to paint all this as some legacy of World War II, of course, led in Germany to a very maybe bigger caution than in other countries into looking into closely into this and into understanding what is really happening for here. I think that also plays a role. We have until now, we've heard it a few days ago with this so-called peace movement that wants the West to get quickly into an agreement with Russia, that there is, of course, still this unresolved look onto history that becomes more complicated with every day, I would say, in the perception of the public. So Germany has a lot of has a lot of things, as Katrin has said, to talk about. The German word would be aufarbeiten, to rework, if I can paraphrase it that way, with regard especially to Ukraine, to Eastern Europe, to everything that's basically east of Germany.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Steffen, do you agree that it's the reporting that was there, the eyes were there, but the Germans were just too if I may say it a little bit more pointedly than Matthias has said, that we were too lazy to listen?
I would certainly agree. I don't know if it's laziness or ignorance, either way. But if I may, I would like maybe not comment too much on the past, but on the present situation in Ukraine and our reporting. As a reporter, basically every single day I have to go live. And as you can imagine, I've been asked again and again in the last couple of weeks, so what is the situation in Bakhmut? Right now we're in Kiev, but the last two and a half weeks we spent in the Donbass region. We're based in Drushkivka, which is about 20-25 miles away from Bakhmut. And in those days we spent there, we went 3 times to Bakhmut. And twice we went on our own. Once we joined a military chaplain who was praying with soldiers. And so we just went in there without any kind of escort. And I think that gave us the chance to see what Bakhmut is like, the constant shelling, to see that there are still civilians, how they live, how they survive. The second time we went in with a German evacuation crew, same thing. We had constant shelling, we had apartment buildings going up in flames, and we could see how tense the situation is there. The third time we went in, we did that when we were invited by the border guards. They are part of the Ukrainian armed forces, and so they took us to a command center, underground command center. They took us to a position where they had grenade launchers and they were launching grenades, and then they took us to another position where snipers were, and those snipers were firing, and the commander told us that they have everything basically under control, and that they've got the drones in the air, and that they repel the Russian assaults, and so on and so on. And so we left, and we did a story, and it was, as you can imagine, kind of tricky how to do this story, because obviously everything we saw and everything we heard was staged. So the next day we learned that the same unit we talked to, they had to pull out of the position where they were because of the Russian advances. So you have to be really super careful with all the information you're getting, also from the Ukrainian side. And as a reporter, because Katrin mentioned before, okay, it's easy, you go and you open your eyes and you report what you see. But even in Bakhmut, which is kind of a limited area, I was unable to tell what the situation is. The Russians, the Wagner group, claimed the other day that they took another village. And so it's really hard for me just to say, okay, this is Bakhmut. We went in there and we talked to the Ukrainian commander. He said everything is under control. I think this is not how journalism works. So that's why when I was asked the day after, so what's the situation in Bakhmut, I was kind of describing what I saw with my own eyes, but I also referred to what the Wagner group was saying, that they claimed that they were occupying another village. And so I think you at least have to mention what the other side says and not just to leave it out as a blank spot. And I think that's also our responsibility as journalists to do that. And I kind of refer to what Olga said before.
Well, thank you so much. And also to using that example that makes it a lot more understandable. I want to turn now to Joanna, to you. For those of us who are in Berlin, I mean, this war feels very, very close. But you're reporting also for the American people, for whom it is a little bit further away. What is your feeling? Are Americans, I know it's a generalized question, but is there a general interest, and how do you report on a conflict which seemingly is far away, but which is actually in a lot of aspects very close? That's the first question I wanted to ask you. And the second one is, NPR does a state of the Ukraine, right? Every day, where you sum up the most important developments. And I should have said that early on when we discussed before our webinar, that it's also, I always religiously listen to that. But how do you make the decision what to put into those 9 or 12 minutes every day? How do you make the selection? Those are the two questions I wanted to pose to you.
Okay, so the first question is, how do we bring this story home, basically, to the US? There has been I should just start by saying that there's been a lot of interest by our listeners in this story from the very beginning. I think the fact, pardon me, I'm recovering from the flu, so pardon my voice. I think that the idea that it's in Europe, that Europe feels closer to the US than any other continent does. I mean, the ties, the cultural ties, the sense of nostalgia that people look at it in the sense of like, oh, I want to go to Paris or to Germany, or they have these just ideas of Europe being sort of connected in some way to the US. So it does feel, it feels close to American listeners. And I think that remember, Americans haven't also recovered from the Cold War. That's still back in their psyche. And there's still TV shows and movies made where the Russians are always the bad guys. So in their mind, when the Russians invaded, it like probably triggered all sorts of ideas that they had about Russians anyway, fair or unfair. So the war feels close already, even though it is physically far away. Secondly, I think that people saw the injustice immediately and immediately reacted to that. And I think all of the US news organizations, the major ones, have done a very good job of showing the impact of this war, not only on people, but on geopolitics and the sense of whether the world feels at peace. And it's unsettled Americans, because Americans, I think, for the first time are thinking, for the first time in a long time, we're thinking, this could be a big war. This could unsettle our sense of feeling safe in the world. If Europe feels unsafe, we feel unsafe. There's also been because the stories have been very good about being human focused, and not just with our network, with the New York Times, with the Wall Street Journal have done an excellent job, the Guardian, lots of Americans read the Guardian, so the people have also fixed in their minds certain stories and certain people. So Americans also are finding lots of stories that they can relate to. A mother trying to make her way in a new city without any resources. But say, a mother that flees to the Polish border, a man who has to choose between staying with his very sick mother and getting his family out of a family in the East, a village in the East. These feel very real to Americans. They sense the not just the innate human drama, but the injustice of it. So it isn't as much of a challenge as it was for I also covered the migration, the mass exodus of refugees from Syria and other countries in the Middle East to Europe, and that was for Americans a much harder sell. They could not relate to that. They did not find some sense of relatability, and I had to work much harder to make that happen. Whereas I feel like with this story, the interest it was already there, and the interest remains very high. What we need to do is just make sure that each story is fair and well documented, well sourced. In other words, fair, well sourced, and in context. Because just going back earlier to the point about the discussion of which I found very interesting about objectivity, I've never believed that such a concept exists. I think as journalists, we just need to be fair. We need to know to go in there, find the story, put it in context, understand that there are opposing views, but figure out how much weight we should give to them so there isn't something like a false equivalency. Because I think the sort of old-fashioned model of objectivity has lent very superficial stories about X says this, Y says this, let's give them 50-50, and of course, as Olha mentioned, that feeds directly into propaganda. So yeah, I feel like our audience has remained very, very interested in this story, continues to after a whole year of this. we got a ton of questions on the live, did a live blog on the day of the anniversary. People were just sending in all sorts of questions about how people are living, about how people are working, about geopolitics. But most of the questions are about, how are the Ukrainians doing? What do they need? How do they manage? How do they see the year ahead? So I feel like in some ways I can pitch lots of stories from here, and my editors will usually go for them because our listeners go for them. To the podcast, I am very new in my job. I just started like a month ago here, so I was part of a group of reporters that rotated in, and this podcast started back then, and it was started by the people in Washington. So I think they decided to put, my editors and other people decided to put in stories that they thought were the most relevant of the day. I'd like to see it more now, since we have a physical presence in Kyiv, become an opportunity to do more discussions, more like 2 ways with local, just local newsmakers or local, influencers. Maybe Olha would like to come on our podcast. I mean, something like that, to have people give some more context and use that format to give a little bit of a deeper dive into the issue of the day. A story can only do so much. A reporter who's witnessed something can only do so much, but an expert, if you bring in an expert.
Bitte eine Quittung.
Great. Hello? Oh. If you bring in an expert to add to the podcast, I think it could be much better. So yeah, I think the decisions on what goes in is not it's not my decision, it's my editor's decision. I'd like it to be my decision going forward, or at least to have some input, because I feel like because I'm here, I see and hear and feel a lot of things that they don't in Washington.
Thank you very much. But what you just heard was Katrin joining us again.
Hi, she's back.
Yeah,
hi, Katrin.
No, she's listening in, but she's still on the board.
Okay.
So we can't bring her back into the discussion, but I think she just paid the cap, and that's what we heard. Now, Emma, you have been waiting very, very patiently. This is the downside of having a big panel. But Emma, you're not only an expert on Russia and Ukraine. If I did my research correctly, you're also an expert on Chinese policy making, and you speak Mandarin. So the question doesn't come at a surprise that we would also love to hear from you. How is, I don't know if you know, but how is reporting on Ukraine and Russia's war on Ukraine and China, and how do you view the whole triangular or whatever you call it, the mix of geopolitical players in and around Ukraine?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. First of all, it's been fascinating listening to everyone, not at all a hardship. And you were too kind. I'm not at all an expert on Russia and Ukraine. I've tried to sort of bolster up my knowledge, but I'm one of these people who'd not reported on the region. Just coming back to one of the points that I think Matthias and Olga both made about the very Moscow-centric perspective. I think it's really important, actually, when we talk about objectivity and the coverage, how the thing that maybe people like me bring to it is our ignorance, but also our lack of that Moscow-centric perspective. And it was really brought home to me at the beginning of the war. I've been trying to learn a bit of Ukrainian, and I mentioned this to a colleague whose sympathies lie entirely with Ukraine and who's been doing brilliant stuff at another outlet, not a Guardian colleague. Their response, I said, I'm learning Ukrainian. They said, but why don't you learn Russian? It's so much more useful in so many other countries. And that it sort of stunned me, but also I just thought spoke exactly to that, the fact that Ukraine had been seen so much through a Moscow perspective, even among those members of the press corps who were sympathetic to Russia. And I pointed out that if I tried to tell people I was learning Russian in Ukraine, it probably would be extremely unhelpful. And I'm among the Guardian journalists who's been sanctioned from Russia. So it would also, it's not that I'd even go to Russia. But anyway, I just thought that perspective was really interesting. In terms of China, I mean, I think it's a particularly topical time to be talking about this. Again, referring back to what one of, I think it was Joanna was talking about people in America feeling that this war affects them. I think actually, certainly myself, I'm guessing a lot of people on this panel feel that this war is important, not just because of what Ukrainians are suffering, but also because what's at stake here isn't just the future of Ukraine. I think it's about sort of what our world order looks like going forward. You know, Putin's pretty definitively torn up the sort of settlement that we had post World War II. And I see a very clear line between not only the sort of lack of attention to and interest in what was happening in Ukraine from 2014, but also lack of interest in and attention to Russia's other wars. You know, Obama's famous red line that wasn't a red line in Syria, you know, the fact that essentially the use of chemical weapons was normalized by Assad and the world allowed that to happen. I think that you can clearly see, you know, why Putin might feel empowered to be making nuclear threats. Of course, there's other reasons to do with his own character and disposition and stuff, but I certainly think that the lack of a response to those other military, you know, ventures in Georgia, Chechnya, I mean, Chechnya perhaps a little bit more complicated for the international community because of the borders, but, you know, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, and you know, by the same token, I think that what happens in Ukraine will determine if you're a dictator and you're looking at a bit of land you'd like, or a dissident population in your own country, and you're thinking about what's the price I'll pay for that. You know, if you were a dictator thinking about using chemical weapons before 2015, you perhaps might look at the example of Saddam Hussein and the pretty high price he paid for it. In fact, for Assad, the use of chemical weapons was quite effective in terms of what he wanted to do, terrorizing the civilian population. And so perhaps a dictator looking at that now would be more inclined to use them. And so I think certainly in China, there's a pretty clear analogy, in fact, beyond just theoretical questions. You know, you have a democracy which has, it's similar, a new democracy, you know, Taiwan's democracy. I'm talking about Taiwan for everyone who doesn't know. You know, it's almost exactly the same age as Ukraine's. Taiwan was a dictatorship, and at the end of the Civil War, it had its first democratic elections for president in 1996, if I'm not remembering wrong. But there was a move towards democracy before that. And, you know, the leadership of China, particularly Xi Jinping, have made very clear that they would like China to be what they would call reunited, which would involve taking over this democracy. So I think, you know, China's clearly watching what's happening in Ukraine very closely. There's a bigger geopolitical reason for China to be interested, which is that, you know, the Chinese government's Chile sort of changed its strategy towards the rest of the world. It sees itself in opposition to the West. We see that in the rhetoric. You know, there was a time, and again, so much of the situation in Ukraine, again, you come back to why it's relevant to the rest of the world. You know, this idea that by engaging with Russia, by you know, that you were talking about Germany pioneering this idea of interdependence, that you would create a world system that even if China had issues about it, would want to support for its own economic stability. That was the basis of the engagement with China really for decades, something that Germany, I think, is still very ambivalent about. A lot of that's still going on with China, even when we're seeing China in some ways being, you know, a rival, you know, in quite worrying ways. And, you know, I think Germany has gone, it's not my area of expertise, I'm happy to be corrected, but it's gone through this process of reconsidering its relationship with Russia, and yet has not done that with China, even though there are many similarities. And for China, looking at challenging, you know, sort of a Western world order or Western dominance, there's not many countries that really, it has allies like Pakistan, but Pakistan is not, you know, it's a big country, it's a populous country, but it's not a sort of major world player. It's not a nuclear power. It doesn't have natural resources. And really, if you look around the world at countries that could be allies for China in that way, you know, America has Europe, Japan, South Korea, you know, Australia. Really, China's sort of unique. And therefore, you know, we saw Xi just before the war began, before the full-scale invasion began, talking about a no limits partnership with Russia. That's why we see China still apparently pretty openly flirting with you know, supplies. It's already giving non-lethal supplies to Russia, but towards making, you know, sales of lethal war material. So I think it's, you know, it's a very concerning relationship, and one that, you know, in the intensity of the full-scale invasion, I think the West would do well to keep its eye on its own relationship with China, as well as China's relationship with Russia. And I think it's probably something that, you know, again, you come back to this question of expertise, particularly in Europe. I think expertise in China is very weak. We have so many, not as many Ukrainian speakers as we should have, but we do have some. We have so many Russian speakers, people who spent time there, studied the country. And if you look at the sort of core of China specialists, it's much smaller. And I think that's an issue.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I think we just have to invite you again to take a closer look at the German and European relationship to China, and if there is a change or not. That's a whole other really interesting and really big question.
Sorry if I went off topic.
No, you didn't go off topic at all, because it's very much, everything is very much interconnected in this changing geopolitical environment. Having also an eye on the time, I see that we are slowly or fast actually running out of it. So I wanted to come to one last issue, and that is something which I heard repeatedly at the Munich Security Conference last week in Munich, the issue of strategic ambiguity. And that for a lot of policymakers, it's still not quite clear what we want, where we want to be in the end. So for example, heads of states are saying very clearly that Ukraine needs to win this war. But not really engaging or saying what that means, or Russia needs to lose this war, but also not saying quite what that means. All of you explained to us that the job of a good journalist is not just to report what you see, but also to explain and to contextualize. And I was wondering, how do you deal with this kind of strategic ambiguity? How do you explain that? How do you put that into context? And I would love to start with you, Olga.
I mean, there's a lot of talking in Ukraine too, among Ukrainians too, about what a victory of Ukraine looks like, what we can consider a victory, what is realistic, and so on. I mean, I think that, I like, of course, that the conversation shifted throughout last year. The conversation shifted from, in the beginning, Ukraine has like 2 weeks to leave or something like that, to Ukraine has to win, and this is the only way out of this situation. I mean, I think a lot of what we do in the Kyiv Independent, we focus on the events that are happening now and the events that we expect to happen in the next couple of months. Like, for example, right now, the dominating issue of the conversation is the expected counteroffensive of Ukraine in spring. So that's sort of our horizon, of like what we can look at realistically. Like, if we want to not have a shallow conversation, but actually bring value to the readers, that's kind of the horizon we can talk about, where we are sort of informed, and we can make conclusions that are based on something. So I would not I'm often asked like how this can end, how the war can end, like when it can end, and so on. And if the last year taught me something, it's not to make predictions, especially not in public. And yes, we're talking a lot about what the victory would be like. For us, it's pretty clear that the Russia as it exists now, and I want to be very careful with how I say it, Russia in the shape and form that it exists now cannot exist for the world to be, like, if the world wants to be safe, the way Russia is now needs to change. It either needs to change in the, in the way that scares everybody, and that means like integrating into something smaller, or there needs to be like a very big shift in the regime. But unfortunately, when we look at the Russian society now, there is a very genuine mass support of the war and hostility towards the West. And that's not, well, I should have probably mentioned it before when I was talking about false narratives in international media. It is not in any way a Vladimir Putin's war. Like, I'm a Russian speaker. As many people on this panel, I have access to, like, I see what the Russian public writes on Telegram channels and chats, and how they discuss, how they talk about the war, what their reactions are to an attack in Ukraine that kills civilians, and how they are gloating. I see what they are being told on Russian television. I have to watch some of those horrible propaganda TV shows. Who work to understand them, I need to watch them. And it's such a traumatized population that is completely, compliant in what is going on. So I see, like, if we're talking about, like, the ambiguity of how this war can end, to me, there is no ambiguity in the sense that Russia can't exist in this way, in this, like, the way it exists now. There is no peace deal. There is no, like, freezing this conflict, because nobody will ever feel safe until something either disintegrates or there is a complete change of regime and some healing process starts with educating the population. But I'm frankly quite pessimistic about that.
Thank you so much. Over to Joanna.
Well, it's been one of the biggest challenges in reporting, I think, sort of trying to make sense of what's reality and what's perception, and in terms of goals and in terms of when this war will end. I mean, President Zelensky at that press conference he had on Friday, I mean, he got a lot of questions about that. And, he was very much like, and when all the Russians are out. And but, is that possible? I mean, there have been, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US thinks that's not possible. So how do we report that? We have to make clear that the Ukrainians and Ukrainians are united in this based on the public opinion polls I've seen, and based on the conversations I've had with my great producers who I love, who help me every single day, is that the Ukrainians are very firm about, like, we want every single Russian soldier out, and we want to go back to, we want our country back. And but as Olha just pointed out, okay, let's say that happens. I mean, does that mean that Ukraine is safe? No, because you need such a drastic shift in thinking in Russia, and something really drastic needs to happen in Russia for Ukraine to truly be safe. And so that is very hard to report, because first of all, it's in the future. But you also have to, the way we deal with it is we try to bring to the front, we try to highlight the voices of people expressing those opinions. This is what we want, and we fear that this isn't going to happen. We try to bring up, like, the points that military analysts think that, maybe Ukraine is going to need to make a compromise. And the fact that the Ukrainian politicians at this point and the Ukrainian public is not willing to compromise. It feels ambiguous to me. And so I try to deal with it in terms of individual stories. I try to address that question. But it's a hard one. I think it's a very difficult, for reporters, it's very difficult to report that, because again, Ukrainians do not want any sort of compromise that would rob them of their country and of their full independence. But even if that happens, again, we have to think a step forward and think, like, Russia's still there. Russia's still very powerful. And even if it's not as powerful as it was before, and it's never going to stop threatening Ukraine with the current mindset that it has. So we deal with it with individual stories. It's a constant conversation we have. I try to keep track of it. And again, I work with excellent producers who are very good journalists themselves. In fact, one of the producers I worked with works for Olha now, Irina Matveyishin, who I absolutely adore. And she's brilliant journalist. For me, I try to take it a step at a time, because I'm not Ukrainian. I haven't spent my career here, and I just try to listen to what Ukrainians are saying, and then try to keep an ear on what military analysts are saying back home and in the UK and other people who watch this war.
Yeah, we are unfortunately already over our allotted time. So I'm looking into the round. Is it okay if we go a couple minutes over time?
If I could go next, that would be lovely, because I've got another live shot in 13 minutes. So I'm a little bit in a rush.
So Stefan, this is also our last round. So the floor is yours, and then Matthias and Emma, and then we close off.
Yeah, okay. So we're all expecting this major spring offensive of the Ukrainian forces. Even if there is a major offensive, and we're not sure about the abilities and the capabilities of the Ukrainian army, and we all know that the Russian forces, of course, are building their defensive lines and that they're digging in. So I think we all agree this is going to be a very long road to be able to push all Russian troops out of Ukrainian territory, including the Crimea. I think concerning the governments in the West, Europe and the United States, they have not really made up their mind what they want. On the one hand, of course, they would be happy to see this conflict end very soon. And there might be governments who would also agree with some sort of treaty between Russia and Ukraine, and maybe even giving up Ukrainian territory. On the other hand, I think the West knows very well, if you don't weaken Russia as much as you can, Russia will just try to rebuild their forces, try to rebuild their ammunition depots, weaponry, and so forth and so forth. And in a couple of years, we're going to have the same situation. So that being said, of course, everybody knows in the West, there has to be some sort of military victory. But again, I'm not sure if our leaders in Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington have made up their minds so far.
Thank you very much. Over to Matthias. Matthias, I think you are still muted. Wait, should I help you? Ton einschalten.
Yep, I'm there. Yeah, I wouldn't give. I honestly, I wouldn't read too much into this strategic ambiguity. Ukraine has said very much what it wants to achieve. Olga has added a few things concerning the neighbor, but this would not be up to Ukraine to influence that. But the result of the war will, of course, have influences on Russia, whatever they might be. But Ukraine has said it wants all its territories back, and that's basically when the war ends. And I think it's not only the government, I think there's a very broad consensus on this in Ukrainian society. Before this full-scale invasion, there might have been voices who were kind of saying, at least in like, you know, not in a political discourse, but in conversations, that realistically some of these territories might not come back. But this is not an option anymore. That's what most feel, because the security threat that these Russian controlled areas were posing is very clear now, and that a militarized Crimea is posing. Besides the feeling of justice, but in the end, it's very hard to predict now what will be at the end, and when will be an end to this war, and whether Ukraine will be able to do this or will not be able to do this at that point, which we are talking about now. It's very hard to predict. And, you know, it's of course the duty of the government to state its aims, but we won't know until we know. And in that case, I feel like this permanent, in the Western discourse, this permanent criticism that nobody states the aims of the war clearly is a little bit academic, because Ukraine has said what its goals is. The West has said it supports Ukraine, and everybody knows that in the end the situation on the ground will decide. So I'm not really worried about you know, Western politicians not saying their red lines. All these red lines have been pretty useless until now.
And last but not least, Emma.
It's a big responsibility to finish it. I'll try and keep it short. I mean, I would sort of agree really with what colleagues have said, which is that you know, Ukraine, one of the reasons that the West is supporting Ukraine is that it's a democracy. And so although the West can advise and express what it wants, and of course the weapons shipments matter, ultimately, you know, Zelensky and his government have to be guided by what Ukrainian people want. Otherwise, why are we supporting them? And it's very clear that at the moment, Ukrainians do not want to compromise, you know, and given their military success and given how they've stunned, I would say 9% of military analysts, journalists, everybody else with their successes, you know, you can see why they would want to keep fighting. Again, you know, talk of this negotiation, the Russians have, you know, Putin has gambled so much on this war, it's very hard to see him wanting to come to the negotiating table at the moment. It's clear he's just throwing more and more stuff about it. Of course, that might change at some point. But so, you know, from the way I see it now, nobody's really in a position where they want to negotiate. I think as journalists, again, as colleagues have said, we should really stick to reporting as much as we can. I do think there's some elements of the context that I feel an old narrative, perhaps from when we were not all paying enough attention, have got stuck. And I would say particularly actually around Crimea, where you often hear people who aren't following that closely talking about, well, maybe Crimea is really Russian. And I think it's in that context important to note things like, you know, even, you know, in the referendum in 1991, yes, the percentage of the vote was lower, but Crimea has been clear since then that it wants to be part of Ukraine. I think also we could perhaps all do with, it's hard to put it into the immediacy of the war, particularly because we can't get at Crimea, but I think the particular suffering of the Crimean Tatars, their deportation, the way in which, you know, even among all the horrors that all of Ukraine endured under the Soviet Union, that their suffering was, and their deportation was particularly extreme, that's one reason you have the demographic makeup that you have there now, and the intense sort of ethnic persecution that they've suffered since the annexation. I think we could all do well to keep those facts sort of in where appropriate in our stories and our reporting, because I think sometimes the discussion around Crimea, I think, is sort of missing context that it could have. And that's an important part when we're thinking about. And finally, just external factors, you know, strategic ambiguity. Well, who knows who's going to be running America in 2024? That could change a lot of things. You know, does China come in? You know, if China sort of doubles down on support for Russia, you know, so sort of making strategic discussions about a war that we don't know what it's really going to look like, I think is possibly, as Olga said, not you know, not the wisest thing to do.
Wow, thank you so very, very much to all of you. This has been an extremely rich discussion, and I think we only touched the surface so far, but unfortunately time is out, and I really, really want to thank all of you for taking the time. Matthias said earlier, we do not know until we know. And there's a lot of wisdom in it. And I think how we know a little bit better before we actually know is because of you. You are our eyes and ears on the ground. You make sense of what is happening for us. As such, you play an immensely important role in this war. And I want to thank you for this role you're playing, but also for taking the time today out of your very busy schedule. I know that many of you have to finish a story or have to run to the next interview or the recording, that you joined us today, because as Aspen Institute Germany, we also want to play a role in explaining. And here we wanted to explain the explainers. And I hope we were able to contribute a little bit to making sense of what you're doing. Thank you very, very much for what you're doing under your, oftentimes risking your own personal safety. I think it's appreciated by everybody and very much by the Aspen Institute Germany and our team. And thank you so much. Thanks to our listeners as well. And I hope to see you soon again. And I wish you good, but especially also safe reporting. And Olga, specifically also to you and your family, all the best. And I hope to see all of you soon again, safe and healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.